I want to talk about an interesting series of tweets I read by Chris Hayes, the MSNBC anchor, and what it got me thinking about COVID-19 and what the virus did and what we did. So here are the tweets. Let's get started. Chris Hayes. I don't quite get the sense of victimization and onerous oppression from the done with COVID crowd. I took the subway and played pickup basketball in New York City yesterday. You can do what you want? Well, I would say to this tweet that I don't think the pinnacle of freedom is being able to play a pickup game of basketball. Last I checked, even some prisoners in prisons get to play pickup basketball. That's not the height of freedom, but okay, fine. Next tweet. An important addendum, and here he's getting more to point. An important addendum is that probably the most disrupted area is childcare, particularly for kids under 5, where exposures and quarantine policies are basically rendering childcare impossible for various stretches that is profoundly upending parents' lives. And there, I think, is starting to getting warmer. But finally, it does a U-turn. But even there, I'd say the driver of disruption is less the policies and more the brute fact that there is a lot of very, very transmissible infectious virus circulating in the population. Ah, fantastic. It's the virus, of course, that did it. It wasn't the policy. It's the virus that did all these things. And recently that echoes something I read in the New York Times where they talked about how the WHO is saying that some kids may never fully regain the educational losses. And they say, well, the virus did that. It was the virus that closed the school. But of course, it wasn't the virus that closed the school, was it? It was human beings who closed the school because they believed it was the appropriate policy response to the virus. But they didn't do it everywhere. There was a place on Earth, a little place called Sweden, where they didn't close elementary schools. And those children have not had the educational losses that we've had in other nations. Those children are doing better. They also didn't die in record numbers from SARS-CoV-2 because the virus is not extremely lethal in children. It's a disease of older people. It is much worse in older people. It has a log gradient. So it got me thinking about what we're doing and what the virus is doing. And I think I'm really worried that we're going to enter a period of revisionist history where people will say the virus did things that the virus didn't do. Let's talk about the quarantining issue. Now, if schools and hospitals were being disrupted because many, many people were feeling sick and they just couldn't perform their duties, well, of course, that's the virus doing that. But if schools are being disrupted principally because one kid in class was ill and then everyone else in that class has to go home for, depends on the rule, 10 days or maybe 5 days and test if they've been vaccinated, but 10 days if they haven't been vaccinated, and there's some difference there, then these are rules that people have made. And the question, of course, is, well, what if you didn't have those rules? What would happen in school if one kid was sick, that kid stayed home, but all the other kids just went to school as if a normal school, and nobody tested, nobody did anything? And the truth is we have no idea that any of these rules are better than the alternative scenario. And in fact, Anthony Fauci himself has said that we will all eventually experience a coronavirus breakthrough infection, ideally after vaccination, but even for people who haven't been vaccinated. Even for people who have natural immunity, I suspect with enough time, they will have a breakthrough. It'll be milder. But we will all eventually be infected with this virus many times in our lives. It is an endemic virus. It's not going anywhere. So what does all this mean? This means that it's not the virus that's keeping most of these places closed. It's the policy. As far as I can tell, many people who feel fine are prevented from going to work because they were exposed to the virus. They're testing asymptomatically positive to the virus. They are still in quote-unquote recovery, even though they've totally symptomatically recovered. And this is all done because the theory is that if we allowed these people back when they feel like they can participate in school or work, that the virus would spread even faster. But that's a theory. It's not proven. And in fact, the IHME, the modeling group from University of Washington, they've written a paper in The Lancet arguing that whether or not you do all of the draconian measures or not, when you're hit with an Omicron wave, it's going to make very, very little difference. In fact, almost no difference at all. It spreads so fast that even the most onerous societal-wide restrictions in their models will not do much to change the trajectory of the pandemic wave. What does all this mean? And this is, of course, it's just one wave. There's going to be more likely pandemic waves to follow as the virus eventually hits populations and pockets that it hasn't yet hit. Anyone who's vulnerable. So what does all this mean? It means that it's not the virus that is causing the disruption. It is our policy. And there are alternative policies, just like it wasn't the virus that closed schools because there are places that didn't close schools. And so I think Chris Hayes initially was trying to say that since he could play pickup basketball, all is fine. But I think the reality is for most people, life is actually severely disrupted in many ways. How is it disrupted in many ways? I mean, I think one of the ways we haven't talked about its disruption is work. Now, my survey of lots of people is that many workplaces are not operating as they did pre-pandemic. They're operating in some form of remote work. Now, I know people feel as if they're getting all the same things done and they're just as productive, and that might be true. There might be some empirical data to support that claim in terms of productivity, but that doesn't capture the full experience of work, because work is not just your productive work. It's also what work does for your ego, your self-esteem, your mental health. And work is a great place where there's camaraderie, where there's a place where people can build communities and networks, and that has been largely deprived in this moment. And so what I think needs to be reinforced is that as long as you have wide-scale disruption of people's working environments, you are having disruption to their day-to-day life. We have wide-scale disruption of travel. You know, when it comes to my line of work, I think invited talks, dinners, travel, all that socializing is 99% disrupted. Very few people are moving forward with those sorts of things. Conferences are disrupted. They're not running at full capacity. These issues are non-trivial. They will lead to changes in people's mental health. Now, it's not the same thing as closing restaurants and shops, closing, parks as we did before. Those were unprecedented restrictions, and I hope and I suspect we will never see them again. And I think free societies have to make new rules as to who is allowed to impose such restrictions and what are the checks and balances on those restrictions. So Chris Hayes may be correct in the sense that he played pickup basketball, but I don't think that fully captures what it means to have a normal life. And college campuses are one great example. It's nothing normal at all. It's extremely disrupted. It's places where kids have to stay in rooms every time cases go up. College campuses are the great microcosm of America. It's the most restricted place, and also it's disrupted not by the virus, but by the protocols for the virus. In fact, many of the kids are vaxxed. When they get sick like they've gotten sick for thousands of years. And some may need some time to recover. Others may feel great really quick, and others may not feel much at all and get out there right away. But it's the restrictions that are being placed on them, the testing, sitting in your room, not being able to share a meal. And that is a severely compromised quality of life. I don't think anyone can deny that. The childcare aspect. Chris is right to come and hit on that point. The childcare aspect is profoundly disruptive. I mean, I think the rate with which schools are running is terrible. Many, many schools going to remote learning. People say that 95% of schools are in person, but that doesn't capture the repeated quarantine periods. It doesn't capture the fact that there are many random remote days. It doesn't capture the fact that some districts have remote days, but then they have snow days where they cancel the remote day, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because unless the snow knocks out your Wi-Fi, then it'll make a lot of sense. So I think the children's space is severely disrupted. Their activities, their ability to play at school, and the fact that they are subject to restrictions, including masking and being constantly doused in a sea of Purell and other such things that weren't that common a few years ago. But I think masking is a real issue, and I think we're going to have to figure out some off-ramps to that. We might have to also answer someday the question that I've written about in The Atlantic and in Tablet magazine. Ben Recht just wrote a really nice paper about it in Newsweek, which is, what was the evidence for it all along? And did you get any better evidence along the way? That might be a question we want to grapple with at some point as a society. But for some people, it's still a little too early to talk about that. They're not quite ready. Ready. So I really worry as we move forward and we start thinking about the pandemic and what was due to the pandemic and what was due to our own actions. I worry that we're going to conflate the two. And we're going to say, well, it was the pandemic that made you close elementary schools for a year and a half. It wasn't us. It was the pandemic that did that. But of course, it wasn't the pandemic. It was us. It was us who decided to close restaurants and shops. It was us who decided to cancel elective surgery. It was us who decided to fire nurses who had natural immunity, refused to get the vaccine. That was our choice. It's us who are imposing the booster mandates on college students. It's us who are tried in Los Angeles to impose that mandate on 12 to 15-year-old boys for getting vaccinated before they can go to in-person school. But it was us also who rescinded that when we saw that that wasn't going to end well. It was going to result in profound discrimination, as many black kids preferentially were pushed out of school, as I saw coming clearly when I wrote about that in U.S. News and World Report. So those were all human actions. And in fact, the more you think about it, you will have to concede that a lot of it was human actions. Now, of course, the virus did a lot. It it decimated people, particularly in nursing homes, particularly older people, particularly pre-vaccine. And it decimated more people after vaccines were available, but many people didn't get it. That was what the virus did. But why didn't people get the vaccine? That's also partly what we did. And although you may argue that it was the work of people who sowed doubt about vaccines, and I don't disagree that they played a role in terms of the harm of the vaccine, it was also people who insisted that the vaccine was something that was to some degree tied to political identity. And so the more people pushed it as part and parcel of a political identity on the opposing side, the more they naturally repelled people who didn't share that political identity. And, there were some key issues about the rollout, which was that when Trump was president, there were letters written to Pfizer and to FDA asking to push the date for data analysis beyond the election because they worried Trump would seize credit. But ironically, that may have inadvertently delayed the vaccine that was life-saving and changed the political valence of the product, which was actually unproductive. And I think we have to be very careful that people who are overzealous and don't want to discuss real safety signals such as myocarditis in boys in a certain age group are actually inadvertently feeding the other side who feel as if information is being suppressed. So I think there's more here. It's a more complex ecosystem than just the bad people and then the good people. The more you make it bad people, good people, the more you yourself also polarize something that should be really politically neutral and really about public health, which should be politically neutral and not a arm of a political party, which I fear it is increasingly drifting into. So back to the Chris Hayes point. I think, I don't know what Chris is talking about in the sense that people who feel as if their lives are governed by severe restrictions are not illogical. Many walks of life are not the same as they were before, particularly work, which is a huge chunk of your waking life. Particularly, I think even travel, it's diminished, and restaurants, and even if some of that is volitional, it's not a draconian mandate, but it is volitional in the sense that it's the response of the people to a certain tenor of media coverage, a certain tone of media coverage. And if that tone is sensationalist and panic-inducing, then that drives people out of businesses. Then to some degree, it's not the virus that did it, it was your media coverage which changed voluntary behavior. It's the deeply concerning, deeply fear-mongering media coverage. And so that also has to be taken into account. So I think when we start to do these analyses to try to tease apart the counterfactual world, what would have happened had we made different policy choices, we have to be really clear about what things we're attributing to the virus, what things we're attributing to human action. And I struggle that we're going to keep conflating the two and mixing the two. So those are my thoughts on this issue. I guess the last thought is there's an excellent paper by John Ioannidis this week in Tablet about what the pandemic has done for democracy. And it echoes a lot of the thoughts I've shared on this channel about what pandemic has done for democracy. I'll put the link down below. Ben Recht has a wonderful piece on N95 masking in kids, which is happening right now in the Berkeley School District, and why that doesn't make a lot of sense. And then I have to say something funny I saw. Just somebody said they, wanted to prove to me that N95s they're not as onerous as I might think they are, but of course I only think they're quite onerous for children wearing them for prolonged periods of time with no evidence that it actually works. But this person said, I just spent all day skiing on the slopes, and I was able to wear it just fine, even had my ski mask over it. Which makes me wonder, why the heck would anyone do such a thing? You're outside in the elements. You don't need to wear an N95 mask when you're outside in the breeze on the mountain slopes. And the fact that an adult can wear it comfortably for a few hours, particularly an adult who's deeply motivated and believes with their whole heart that it's a valuable and virtuous thing to do, that's not surprising to me. If I felt so strongly, I'm sure I could summit Mount Everest with an N95 on if I was really a believer that it was helping. But when I would be out there alone by myself on the Western Ridge, I would ask myself, why am I wearing this by myself out here on this, nearing the summit of Mount Everest? And I would probably take it off. So that's just me, because I like to do things that actually work. But it's a pesky problem I have. So those are some thoughts on this issue. I I suppose this was a little bit more rambling than I'd like to be, but I think the key issues are, one, are we subject to restrictions? And I think you cannot just think about the rules. You have to think about people's behavior. Two, you have to also think about work, and you have to also think about children. And by those metrics, I think we're subject to severe disruptions right now as we speak. Is it due to the virus, or is it due to us? And us should include the media coverage of the virus, which has been terrible. And then the more you think about it that way, the more you'll see a lot of it is due to us, and not the virus, but our policies around the virus. The virus will become a virus that infects almost everybody. That's what Anthony Fauci said. Not even me anymore. I said it, but then a week later, Fauci said it. So it's not I say Fauci says it. Fauci says it. And I think that's right. And as long as that's the case, all the policy questions change. They fall like dominoes. That's a real substantively different finding. And it is different because of Omicron, because Omicron has done something very different to the ability of the vaccine to hold back a mild symptomatic illness. And of course, the vaccine is great, I think, for holding back really severe disease. And I still see that. Omicron's also milder. That helps too. But symptomatic disease, it's not as good at holding it back. And likely boosters will have some period of time they work well, but then it will diminish. And that will change, as Fauci has pointed out, that will change the nature of the pandemic. The folks in UW modeling, they are some of the most ardent proponents of restrictions, but even they say that all this mitigation will do not much to blunt the waves of the pandemic when Omicron strikes. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing with these prolonged disruptions in a society where anyone who wanted to be could be vaccinated over the age of 5, where anybody who, any adult and people at high risk can certainly be boosted if they wish? What are we doing by prolonging these restrictions, even if those restrictions are the ones that are a byproduct of bad media coverage or the legal departments of companies and their reluctance to push for returns to work? And I think we're not seeing the downsides of that, which are impacts on mental health, etc. So that's all I got for you. If you like this video, you know what to do. Wear that N95 skiing. No, just kidding. Just like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. When you're outdoors, you're good. Until next time.